John Berger, critic, broadcaster, novelist, collaborator in plays and films, you wrote once that most artists in their lifetime have only one or two underlying themes, though they may work on other subjects. What are your underlying themes?
Yes, of course, it's easier to see it in the work of others than in one's own. But I would think that the first underlying theme, from which I can't get away, because it's not something you choose, it is something, it is a kind of obligation, a kind of compulsion. I think the first one is probably to do with the experience of emigration. But in the very broadest sense of the terms, of people being displaced, if you wish, either voluntarily or forcibly. So exile, emigration, seems to me to be one theme. Another one? No, actually I can't think of it. I think I have only one.
How can emigration, displacement, become a compulsion for you? What can be the origin of that for you? I mean, that seems to me a sort of conceptual way of looking at the world, almost. You feel compelled to keep writing about it.
No. That's the problem with questions, because we often put the coat on inside out. It's not that I say to myself, I'm going to write about immigration, or I'm going to write another book like that. On the contrary, for example, at this moment, I'm planning in my head, it's so early and it's so difficult to see for the moment, but I'm planning in my head a new book, which might be called Pizza Hut. This chain of pizza stores, American, across Europe. And it might be about one of the boys who delivers them on little motor scooters. I mean, that's all I know. I know a bit more. But probably when it's finished, I will see that in this book there is yet another aspect of this experience of displacement. But it's not something that I choose. Okay, the first book I wrote was actually really about a painter of our time. That was really about an exile here in London who was a Hungarian painter. And then, at that moment, I can be a bit more rational, but always more rational, but in a way one always comes up to another mystery. What I was going to say is that at that time, nearly all my close friends were emigres. They were Hungarians, Germans, Poles, Austrians, some Italians. They were all older than me. They'd all suffered much more than I had. But for some reason or another, they put up with me. And I became very close to them.
You also stress in your thinking, I think, the relationship between the writer and the people among whom he lives. Where do you live?
Where do I live? Literally, in the Alps. Well, I live in the place that the trilogy about peasant life in the mountains, Into Their Labours, is called. I mean, I live where I received that.
Are you one of them or an observer of them? Are you at home there or dislocated there?
No, I'm certainly not one of them, because maybe I would like to be, but I never will be. I'm an observer, but an observer who has become an intimate in some ways with them. I mean, it seems to me that the whole question of where one is when writing has to do with this. There's that phrase by Robert Capa, the photographer, who said something like, when the picture's not good enough, go closer. And it seems to me that what I've tried to do, in fact, in maybe all the books I've written, is to get in very close. And then try to bring something back from a starting point outside. How much I succeed and even what I'm bringing back, I often don't know. But now, just talking to you, something interesting occurs to me, because maybe when I say that displacement is the theme, recurring theme of my books, I suddenly see, tonight talking to you, that maybe the actual way I work implies this displacement of going in as close as you dare, and then finding, sometimes with difficulty, a way back.
Going in as close as you dare suggests that you're writing always about real people, but you are a writer of fiction.
Oh. I mean, I've always thought that this sort of category between fiction, written fiction, and real people is a not very deep one. Because, I mean, everybody finally writes about real people. I mean, okay, the names change, things change, different things happen to them. But in fact, they are real people, it seems to me. And in my case, yes, of course I could give a kind of table of prototypes for perhaps all the characters in all my books. But at the same time, when they were assembled, they would have very, very little to do with those characters. Only for me, they were what I could listen to. Yes, because it's all a question of listening. Not just only listening to words that people say, but listening to what people are.
You spend part of the year in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to write more about cities? The Pizza Hut will be in a city, not
Yes,
in the Alps.
You've guessed right, I'm sure, yes. That's right.
You used to be a Marxist. Are you still?
Well, it all depends how much you've read Marx and how much you've studied Marx. Because this label has been put on me for nearly 50 years, and it really means two things. I mean, those who say, are you a Marxist? I mean, in the sense that I think probably they mean the term, I would say no, and I never was, really. But if somebody asks me who has really studied Marx, like I have, then I would say, yeah. I mean, we've been to those places, we've learnt those things, and I was a Marxist, and insofar as my thinking hasn't profoundly changed about the world, I'm sure I still am.
You were born and brought up in England, and you live in Europe. Why is that?
People ask me that from time to time, and it's quite difficult to answer, because it's as though what happens, the decisions one takes, as though they are much clearer retrospectively. One tries to make them clearer than they are in reality. You know, when 30 years ago you and I were working for Granada Television, and there were our little offices. I mean, we never possibly imagined that we would be sitting here now like this. And it seems to me that life is full of the unpredictable. And actually the present is always something very tentative, possible to change, not certain, hesitant. And then, when one looks back upon it, like, okay, so 30 years ago, I left Britain and went to Europe. What's the explanation? At the time, I didn't know. Now, well, now I suppose I would say a tiny bit that maybe 30 years ago, but I didn't even know it then, and the word didn't exist. But maybe 30 years ago, somewhere I wanted to be a European writer, or I wanted to try to be a European writer. And if, in all due modesty, I say this, I mean, it's not that I want to boast, but if you ask me, what do I mean about being a European writer? Well, even in the little village in the mountains now, when something happens in the world which I think is really important, in this dark time, it's often something terrible. And I feel very strongly about it, and I feel obliged to write it. I feel as though it is a kind of duty to say something about this. And I write something. I mean, it could have been the army being sent into the Parliament buildings in Moscow a few years ago. It could have been the Gulf War, or it could be something more contemporary, not always so somber as that. Or when the French Prime Minister killed himself. Well, anyway, when I have something to say, I write it. And it is published. This sounds like boasting, but it's only to show what I mean by European. I mean, it is published probably within 3 days in Greece, in Spain, in Germany, in Sweden, in Holland, quite often in France, and quite often in Britain. That's what I mean about having a European voice, perhaps.
Are you writing about a Europe that endures or a Europe in flux?
Or Europe in flux. A Europe that has endured for very long. A Europe in flux, a Europe which is very confused.
Does the peasant life of the mountains endure, or is that dying?
No, it's dying. It's dying, but it dies more obstinately and more slowly than any of the experts, perhaps even including myself, but I'm not an expert, predicted. But it's dying because the way of life, the economic way of life, which sustained it, is no longer viable exactly within the European community. I mean, in a certain sense, that is something which the modern Europe of today is eliminating and making obsolete. And that is quite a grave thing to do, in a way, because what it also means is that you are making obsolete not only a way of life, but a certain form of dignity, one of the variants of human dignity. And we have such need of all those variant examples today.
Your new novel, To the Wedding, which I found vivid and startling and beautiful, is about a wedding in which the bride has AIDS, or anyway is HIV positive, and knows that she will soon die. How did you come to write that?
After I finished the Peasant trilogy, I didn't say to myself, but something said to me, there is a book that needs to be written about AIDS. A novel. Some kind of book. I mean, I had read quite a lot that had been written, including extraordinary books of témoignage, of witnessing. And so I began thinking about it, began making notes. When I begin a book, it's terrible. You couldn't believe how bad all my beginnings are. And often that goes on for a year or two. And of course, I had, like all of us, quite a number of friends who had AIDS or who was seropositive. And then, strange relation between life and invention. Then, in fact, my daughter-in-law, my son's wife, discovered that she was seropositive. And then I asked myself whether I could go on writing this book. But eventually I decided I could and would. Yeah.
It's a happy book in many ways. It's saying that life is something strong and wonderful, is it not?
I think it's too soon for me, in a way, to know what I brought back. Yes, I think happy, I don't know, but probably there is hope in it. I think so. And maybe, that's another word that I mentioned, there is perhaps a kind of dignity in it. As soon as you begin to observe that maybe there are those qualities, or it's very dangerous, because then you can begin to simplify and cover up. And it seems to me that one has to be unflinching. And in a kind of way, I think, well, I don't know, it's for others to judge. But also, I mean, I in relation to that story, in relation to that book, I think that my gaze is steady and unflinching. And the effort was there. If somebody else tells me now, whilst I was making that effort, that there is actually a deposit of hope in the book, I'm very glad to hear it. But it's, of course, not what I could be thinking about at that time.
Where were you born, precisely?
Stoke Newington, in 1926, Filey Avenue, 1, number 1.
Who was your mother?
My mother was called Miriam. She came from Birmingham. And she had been a suffragette. And her father worked in a warehouse looking after horses. He was a kind of groom in some beer warehouse, I think, in Birmingham. And she was a very mysterious person, very secretive. And she always, well, she didn't say this, she only said this when I was about 30. She said, I always wanted you to be a writer. Even before you were born, I said, I want my son, if it is a son, or a daughter, if it's a daughter, to be a writer. I look at her. And then, and I say, and have you read any of my books? Of course not.
Just enough to be a writer. Who was your father?
My father, he was called Stanley Joseph, and he was the son of an emigre from Trieste who emigrated to Liverpool. And he, if I'm not mistaken, my father was actually born in Liverpool before moving to London. He was a man so marked by that terrible First World War. He was an infantry officer, and he was for all 4 years in the front line on the Western Front. Very, very few infantry officers actually survived as long as that. He was obviously a very brave soldier. But it completely marked him for the rest of his life.
Closed him up? How marked him?
No, it hadn't closed him up. No. I think it's something to do with pain, not physical pain. But he carried a kind of pain with him. But he was quite jovial, quite jokey, quite open. And also, in fact, I think it did something else, because before the war, in fact, he wanted to be a priest. And after the war, I think he remained croyant, he remained a believer, but but he certainly didn't become a priest.
Was your childhood happy?
No. But it really wasn't their fault.
Where did you go to school?
I went to a early prep school near Guildford, which was totally crazy. You can't believe the things that happened there. In terms of sadism, in terms of torture, in terms of bullying. And it was a quite small school, and this is not only between boys, it was also between the staff and the boys. Absolutely monstrous place. And because it was a little totalitarian system, because what does that mean? It means that there's no appeal outside it. And therefore, although maybe some of us tried to say or talk about the things that happened, nobody believed us. There was no appeal outside, and so finally you live within it. And you develop ingenuities to cope.
At the age of 16, you ran away from another school,
Yes.
didn't you? Why was that?
Well, because it was a bit the same, but bigger. And because I couldn't bear it anymore.
Did you want to be a painter then? Or a bit
Yes.
later?
No, I already actually, I think I really wanted to be a painter then, although I was also writing. No, but yes, I wanted to be a painter then. Yes, certainly.
You went into the army, you went to art school, and you went into the army during the war.
Yes.
What stayed with you from that? What was that experience like?
Well, I joined the army in the end of 44. Is that right? Yes. And then, in 45 the war was over. So, I was in the army for about a year, or a bit over a year. And I was simply in an infantry regiment, and I did my training, and then I became a lance corporal instructor.
Did you meet people whom you otherwise wouldn't
Yes,
have met?
absolutely, of course, and this was very important, and it was part of my political education, maybe one of the most important parts of it, because I met, and especially because I didn't take a commission, which I refused to do. So I was mostly with recruits, working class recruits, and I lived with them, and I got to know them, and I began to see a world that I hadn't really any very clear idea of before, and this was very important to me, and I used to write letters for them. A number really couldn't write. I mean, they were really illiterate. Others had difficulty in writing. So, and they knew lots of things I didn't know. They were tougher than I was. But insofar as they protected me, and they quite often did, I mean, in exchange, I could at least write letters for them. Love letters, and or letters to their parents, or letters making up some story which wasn't true.
But that companionship has stayed with you, with working people.
I think so, yes. Yes, yes.
When you became a painter, what sort of stuff did you paint?
Well, it developed and changed. To begin with, it was quite romantic. If you like, a tiny bit like Chagall, let us say. I mean, just to give you an idea, of course, of not that quality. Many of the subjects came from the Bible, from the Psalms and from the New Testament, because the Bible was always a book which was very important to me. Even at the time when the label Marxist was placked there 5 times a week on me.
As art critic of the New Statesman, when I first remember encountering your work, you were rather polemical. What were you arguing?
What was I arguing? Well, I mean, I think I was arguing lots of things. But if one wants to simplify a great deal, I think that I was really arguing against the upcoming, extremely intolerant new orthodoxy of that time, which was more or less American abstract expressionism. And it wasn't that necessarily that I was opposed to all that painting entirely, but I was opposed very, very strongly to the orthodoxy it insisted upon within the art world. I think more or less the argument might be something like that. What's quite interesting is that we, or few of us, left-wing Marxists, not all the others reading the Bible sometimes, we all said at the time that the exaggerated world promotion of American painting at that time was in actual fact a political action, and that probably it was supported by the CIA. They said, paranoia, etc., etc. And now all the papers show that it was true.
In 1968, it's jumping on a fair long way, you wrote in a preface to, I think, a collection of your painting criticism, Permanent Red, that my aim has been to help, in however small a way, to destroy this, meaning our bourgeois society. Why did it need destroying, in your view?
Because it was so unjust. Because so many injustices existed in it. And because, well, if we go from 68 to see what happened later, which I think is the logical thing to do from that, because of course this has become more and more extreme. Because now, what happens? We live in a world which is a global system, where most of the really important decisions taken about what is happening in that world and what is going to happen, being prepared for the future, are taken first of all by people whose names we don't even know, who are not elected in any elections, but who are the directors of the big new financial structures. Yes, multinationals and World Bank, etc., etc. And in relation to whom even politicians of left or right are relatively powerless. Okay, and what do they do? It's not that I think they're individually monsters at all, but they belong to a system and they organize a system in which human salvation in this wretched world in which we live so often, human salvation, the only possibility of any sense, depends upon profit, depends upon keeping the system going, which means the acquisition of more and more profits. Now, and this is new because in the past, this was always qualified by other considerations of various sorts. I don't want to give a history lesson. Now, there is no other consideration. And so this is a kind of fanaticism. So often we accuse these opponents of our system as being fanatics, but our system is fanatic to an extraordinary degree because it is the only value. Profit is the only value, the only saving value.
So all the people that you write about in your works, which are both real and fiction, live and survive and exhibit their various strengths within this system.
Yes, because of course people resist all the time, and they are ingenious, and they find ways of making sense of other senses. Of course. I mean, if I define the system like that, and I think, although crude, it is true, that is not defining all that is happening in the system. Of course not. Of course not. Millions of individual lives go on with different values and contradictions and resistances and pockets of resistance and seeking alternatives, and other people seeking checks on some of the madness of this system. Like the people at the moment all over the world protesting against it. Okay, it's not quite the part of the same thing, but some of the same arrogance is behind it, protesting now against the French nuclear tests in the Pacific. So, I mean, and of course what's really interesting, because I don't find it so interesting to talk about long-term political perspectives, because I'm not a politician. I'm just somebody who tries to go close to experience and bring something back.
Of all the people that you've written about, one of the most remarkable for me is the doctor that you wrote about with Jean Moore in A Fortunate Man. Mm-hmm. What attracted you to write about him?
Well, first, because he was a very good doctor. Very, very good doctor. And because he really cared about people. Then, because he was working in the Forest of Dean, in a quite underprivileged area, I suddenly saw that, in fact, probably none of the people around him and whom he treated would ever be able to define or really talk about what he did for them. It's not that they weren't grateful, but to formulate it. Maybe even I wanted to formulate it for them. I wanted to formulate it for them. And perhaps for him. But I can't stop there. I have to tell you the rest, because when that book was written, and he saw it, and he liked it, and of course he passed it, and so on, because the life he was living there, had been formulated, because it had a kind of profile, a portrait drawn around it, he wanted to change it, and he wanted to go elsewhere, because it was defined, and because he was essentially a very adventurous man. He was no longer satisfied with it. He wanted then to go and be a doctor in the Third World. And from that moment onward, things began to go badly for him, very badly. And I think that book played a role in that. I don't regret it. I don't feel guilty about it. But this enigma which life is.
You spotted that he was depressive.
Yes.
Were you surprised when he committed suicide?
Yes, I was very surprised. I was very surprised because I'd spoken to him about a week before, and he'd invited me to his wedding. He was going to get married again. He was a widower. He was going to get married again. So, in fact, I was very surprised. But I think, God forbid, I don't know. And John Esco, that's his real name, and forgive me if I say something not right here, but I think that he was a man so interested in trying to alleviate suffering that actually he couldn't stand happiness.
You're coming up to be 70, not too far ahead. Do you have any regrets in your life? Are there things you haven't done that you wanted to do?
I don't think, in fact, I'm the sort of character or the sort of person who regrets very much. I mean, there are thousands of things I regret, which is when I'm unjustly angry, or I lose my temper, or I'm impetuous in some kind of way. I mean, those kind of regrets, of course, full of them, like perhaps all of us, but perhaps even more with me. I don't know, because I'm sometimes foul-tempered, and I'm very impetuous. But for the big things, I don't think so. And I don't know why exactly, except that I think that probably I think quite hard before a big thing. And anyway, then one is carried on it, like the surf of a wave, and then one is on the next one. And because I'm not very retrospective, and because I'm not very introspective either, except when other characters are living within me, and then I'm very introspective. But about me, John, I'm not very introspective, and therefore I'm not very, no, I don't have great regrets. Maybe it's of weakness.
You've done so much. How would you like to be remembered?
By what? Maybe by what I've brought back.